There we go, yeah. Well, welcome to Our Sea Needs Our Say. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to get stuck here. We've never had so many people at one of these events before. It did occur to us we might need a slightly larger venue for this event, so thank you for confirming our hunch in that regard. Some of you, or many of you perhaps, won't know exactly the way we do things, so I'll just outline that before we begin. I'll briefly introduce our guests, then I'll ask them a few questions, then there'll be an interval, and then we'll come back and throw the discussion open to the floor. I want to introduce these three writers by reference to another writer. Daniel Defoe couldn't be here this evening, but he did visit Bridport. He was here in or about 1722. He didn't think much of it. In fact, he described Bridport as a town in which we see nothing remarkable. So he obviously didn't know about our lectures. He did like, however, he didn't think much of the town, but he did like the harbour very much, what we now call West Bay. And the reason he liked West Bay so much was because of what he described as the incredible numbers of fish which he watched being caught off the beach there. He described nets so heavy the men could hardly haul them ashore. Mackerel, he wrote, the largest and finest I ever saw, were sold at the seaside 100 for a penny. Now, that was Lyme Bay, right? This is not Norway or Newfoundland or somewhere in the Pacific. Lyme Bay. Now you might say, well, that's just an old story in an old book. You might well think that, but think again. One idea I actually had about calling this event was think again, but I think probably we opted for a better title in the end. But do think again about that. Professor Callum Roberts, put your hand up if your name is Professor Callum Roberts, that's it, yes, has collected and collated a mass of material from archaeological sites, from the accounts of early explorers, from fishing data, from the memoirs of sporting anglers, and the case that he has built is now irrefutable. We have massively underestimated the numbers and size of the fish which lived in our seas before industrial exploitation of fish stocks began. And the reason this matters is that it has permanently skewed our picture of the current state of our seas. We have gone on hammering the marine environment, and we have, little by little, grown accustomed to thinking of seas as healthy, which are in fact seriously degraded habitats. Callum Roberts has studied and personally monitored marine protected areas around the world. He was directly involved in setting up a network of marine protected areas in the North Atlantic, totaling 300,000 square kilometres. What's that in miles? Okay, it doesn't matter. Anyway, it's very, very large. Yeah, okay. He's working with Blue Marine. He's a trustee, in fact, of the Blue Marine Foundation, which is an organisation now working together with responsible local fishermen in Lyme Bay. And he will be addressing the Blue Marine conference in Weymouth tomorrow. If you haven't heard about Blue Marine, all will be explained in due course. Right, that's that one. Daniel Defoe was not only the novelist of Robinson Crusoe and Noel Flanders, he was also one of the great journalists of his day. George Monbiot's column in The Guardian is often controversial. It is consistently provocative, well-informed, and very well written. He has held our public culture to standards it has perhaps never needed as urgently as it needs them now, and nowhere more so than in environmental policy. If you're not familiar with his work, you should be. His concern for the sea, in particular, flows right through his latest book, emerging at full pressure in the last chapters. And these include an account of diving for spider crabs in Cardigan Bay, which I would recommend. I'd also say, actually, to anybody who's interested, that our wonderful poster, which Joanna did, really, but it's from an image by Richard Kirby, and the creatures, if anyone is curious, are the larvae of spider crabs. Those final chapters of Ferrell also include his exchange with one of the overseers, a minister for rural affairs, one of the overseers of Cardigan Bay's so-called special area of conservation. This is George at his sardonic best. I strongly recommend it, not least as a useful point of contrast or comparison with the situation in Lyme Bay. Philip Hoare was in Bridport early this year, in fact, to give a talk about whales as in the creatures. He has been crucial to making this evening happen, so we're very grateful to him for that. Both of his most recent books have been centrally concerned with the sea and with the literature of the sea. Leviathan was about his fascination with Herman Melville and Moby Dick, as well as sperm whales. His latest book, The Sea Inside, sees him journey from his native Southampton to the Azores, to Sri Lanka and New Zealand, in his search for what the sea means to him and what it might mean to us. Melville's subject in Moby Dick was, of course, the white whale, but Philip's work, like Melville's, it might appear to be about the sea, but it is actually about lots of things, not least Western commercial monomania and the abusive relationship with the natural environment, which is its inevitable result. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Philip Hoare, George Monbiot, and Callum Roberts. Right, I'm going to start with some questions for Philip. One of the processes you've chronicled in your work is the almost miraculous speed of change in our attitudes towards whales. Could you say a few words about that, and whether you think that change extends to our attitudes about the sea in general?
I think that's a very good question, given why we're sitting here and the subject that holds us here tonight. We live in extraordinary times because we've moved in our relationship to the sea from, as you said in your introduction, an exploitative one to an attitude which questions that exploitation. And I think there's nothing that embodies that more physically and more in more ways than just environmental, in cultural, in literal, in artistic, in spiritual ways. And I don't hesitate to use the word spiritual in this respect, because my mother wore makeup made with whale oil. I ate stork margarine, which contained whale oil. We played tennis with rackets strung with whale guts. Where I lived in Southampton, there were ships coming up from the South Atlantic laden with whale oil for processing and for entering the human food chain and for various other aspects. That changed in a most remarkable way, really, in the late 60s and early 70s, as we were sensitised to the plight of these animals, which was already known at the beginning of the 20th century. The discovery expeditions in Antarctica were documenting the degradation of the populations of whales, the great whales down there, the blue whale, the fin whale, the humpback whale. But when Roger Payne, who was a sort of rather eccentric character, along with Scott McVeigh, they were really basically hippies, took a microphone and dropped it into the sea to record a humpback whale singing. The whole, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the whole of the environmental movement was born because of suddenly that which we had abused was given a voice. And I've spoken to people who were whaling in the British whaling industry in the 50s and 60s who said, if the animals had been able to scream, they could never have done their work. So we've gone that really quick change within the space of generation, within all our lifetimes, certainly, from seeing whales as an industrial resource, from a period in the 19th century up to the 1850s, when the discovery of mineral oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, up until that point, that which we used mineral oil for, we'd used whale oil for. So the streets of Berlin, London, Paris, and New York were lit by whale oil. The Industrial Revolution, in many ways, was lubricated by it. Whale bone, which is baleen from a rorqual or a mysticeat whale, was used in the same way that we use plastics now. So it was a built-in part of the Industrial Revolution. It was America's second biggest export, after timber. So very quickly went from that meaning to this new meaning, and it's why, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, these new movements really drive their power and their motivation really from the Save the Whale campaign.
But do you think that has extended to our sense of the relationship to the sea more generally? I mean, in a sense, these are very attractive, very large creatures.
Yeah, there's the rather dismissive phrase of some biologist, charismatic megafauna. I'm sure Callum might have used it, but I certainly have, because sometimes it's like the panda, It's so easy to get excited about, these extraordinary animals and less so about phytoplankton. But
in a sense, there'd be no argument about Lyme Bay if that was extending to other creatures.
No, exactly. But, they are great carriers, and I think one of the great things talking about the natural world and about animals in particular is the challenge of how to deal with them in a cultural way, because and the great thing is that we have George and Callum here who are, great proponents of what they do, but also they're great writers. And if they weren't great writers, would it work? So, to write about nature is often to anthropomorphise. And I don't know what Callum would say about that, and I'd be interested to see what George would say. But I think sometimes you need to do that to. After all, that's the only way I can express, as a writer of myself personally, what I feel about this, and I'm not a scientist.
Okay, let's ask them anyway. Actually, what do you think about that idea that you have to anthropomorphise an animal to write about it? Or
you certainly have to engage with it in a way which requires projection. You can't write about it without putting something of yourself into that animal. And I suppose that could be anthropomorphism. It could be seen as something rather more personal than transferring the whole of human characteristics into it. You're transferring something of yourself into it. You're trying to understand it by seeing it from your own point of view. And of course, we perceive everything by those means. But I think this touches very much on what Philip's talking about, that it's that empathy with animals, which seems largely to have been missing from human relationships with animals until relatively recently, but has been this terrific shift over the past century or so. And through the work of people like Peter Singer and others, but also through these sort of much more organic movements of people just sort of spontaneously changing their relationship with animals, we are seeing a profound redefinition of our engagement, not just with the natural world, but also with the world of domestic animals too. And I think, by and large, at least in concept, it's a redefinition for the better.
Philip, you are yourself a campaigning journalist for several papers, a tireless traveller and public speaker, but the books are literary, they are sort of contemplative in tone. We were talking earlier about Melville's relationship with science and so on. I wonder what do you feel a literary approach specifically brings to this subject?
Up until recently, it's been much more easy to read literature rather than science. on these subjects. The barrier between us and science is now being broken down partly because of people like Callum and George, very much so, because, you know, it's much more in the public discourse, I think. Before, it was much more separated, partly because of the language used. So literature can overcome that. Also, people's need for a narrative. You know, the reason why Moby Dick works as a book, despite its 136 pages, you know, 36 chapters rather, so it's about 650 pages, is because it's a compelling narrative, you know. And the reason, you know, and Melville is writing about natural subjects. We were joking earlier, this is the only work of fiction, which could have an entire chapter on zooplankton. Is the reason why that works is because it's this, it has that, you know, the thing that we all want, which is a story. And the story of Moby Dick has as much meaning now as it ever had then. In fact, of course, the reason Moby Dick was a failure in Melville's time because actually people didn't really get it. And the story of Moby Dick, the story of Ahab, this obsessive, monomaniacal captain who goes in pursuit of a whale which dismasted him, bit off his leg. It's probably not an albino whale, it's a white whale. And in fact, actually in the book, the imputation, it's not only his leg it bites off. A friend of mine says it should be called Moby No Dick. In fact, actually that friend was Keris Matthews. But so he goes in pursuit of this animal, you know, chasing it halfway around there with this ship of fools, you know, in a way, which is a great analogy for lots of things. I mean, it was an analogy for American imperialism and slavery and race relations in his time, and has been taken to, you know, analogies. Edward Said compared, you know, Bush's pursuit of Saddam Hussein as
nuclear testing.
And nuclear testing, exactly. But what Melville's saying, which is the most beautiful thing, is that Ahab is investing this animal with a sense of evil. It's impossible. Animals are not evil. Human beings who are evil. That's the message. And that message is as strong as ever now.
How did you actually come across Melville in the first place? How did that happen?
Well, I'd actually studied Billy Budd at college back in the 70s, and it's quite interesting because actually the reason why we now even know about Moby Dick is because Billy Budd was published. It was unpublished in Melville's lifetime when he died in 1891. It was published in 1924, and when people like Virginia Woolf, Ian Forster, D.H. Lawrence, crucially D.H. Lawrence, Auden, read Billy Budd, they went back to the kind of the back catalogue, as it were, picked up on Moby Dick. Lawrence proclaimed it as a work of futurism before futurism had been invented. You know, so suddenly there was this sense of this sort of the exploding time bomb of this book, and its message kind of concurred with the time, and it's still really being interpreted now in a way, its power. And for me, so I got to it through Billy Budd and through going to New England, which is really, we were talking about this earlier, New England has a great spirit. I mean, it is the place of Thoreau, you know. It still does feel like that. There is a sense of that relationship to nature. Partly because for me, it was the first place I saw my first whale in the wild. You know, I'd seen captive whales as a child. So it's the first place I saw, you know, this amazing, you know, animal breaching out of its environment, this 50-ton, 50-foot humpback whale breaching out of the water. You know, physically demonstrating its connection to us, you know, its mammalian nature, and just sort of hanging there, surrounded by this sort of spray of sea, you know, a very poetic moment. And of course, I reacted in a very poetic way. I said, "Fuck!" And there's no animal has been better named. Maybe Callum's got some better contenders, but I think it's binomial. It's Latin binomial, Megaptera Novo Angliae, which is big-winged New Englander, and it's like a barnacled angel hanging there, you know, and it seemed to connect me to that, you know, and as a writer, it's a kind of a visceral moment. I think that's really implicit in what the three of us feel in our connection with nature.
Another theme in your writing is a theme of home, and especially in this last book, which it seems in some way, I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems in some way to run parallel with the sea theme in your work. You wrote in The Sea Inside that home doesn't exist, and we all live there. The sea, of course, does exist, and we don't live there, but you seem drawn to it almost as if you should live there. What do you think that's about?
Well, I have a very conflicted relationship with the sea because I grew up next to it in Southampton and Port City, but I never learned to swim until I was 25. I had a very odd relationship. See, I feared it. I still do fear it. I swim in it every day now. I learned to swim when I was 25 in a very dingy Victorian tiled pool in Hackney. But now I'm sort of, with the zeal of a convert, you know, I just swam in it this afternoon and was thrown head over heels in the West Bank. My face was scrunched up in the gravel like that. I looked like one of the bog men. And I swim it, you know, winter, spring, summer, or fall, you know. Sometimes even in winter, if the tide falls right, I swim even before dawn in the dark, you know, when there's snow on the beach. And it's just such an intense thing because what else gives you that connection with you know, another reality? You know, that you can be in somewhere as suburban as Brighton and suddenly you are suspended above the water, out of gravity really. And that is an incredibly powerful thing, you know, for me. And so, in a way, you know, the sea continues for me as a kind of, it's a release, it's a spiritual connection as much as, you know, as what we're discussing here tonight, what it might contain, but of course it's the fact of what it contains that gives that power as well.
I want to, obviously this is, Lyme Bay is the occasion for this whole discussion. I mean, you're from the south of England. Is there any, what do you see as the best possible outcome in a situation like that? What do you think a marine protected area ought to mean in Lyme Bay?
I don't know, you know, I mean, it's such a hugely, because the whole thing has become so heavily politicized in a way that it's, I sometimes think that there's no reconnecting us in a way sometimes. I think that connection might have been lost in a way, and that I get quite sort of despondent about that because of the whole notion of the sea being such an easy place to hide things, you know, to hide what we put into it, you know, the pollution which is, you know, invisible really because it's beneath the sin. What Herman Melville called the ocean skin, this thin layer, this sort of diaphragm between us and it. And I think there's something about that which will always be challenging in a way, and I'm not sure how you correct that really in a way. So from my point of view, I'm going to be very interested to hear what George Callum said about that.
Let's do that. Yeah, Callum. I want to ask you obviously about your wider experience, but I'd like to ask about Lyme Bay first in a way. You're addressing, as I said, the Blue Marine Conference tomorrow. Could you explain what Blue Marine is, what it has done elsewhere, and what it is doing in Lyme Bay?
Well, yes, thank you. Blue Marine Foundation was founded by Charles Clover and George Duffield and Chris Gorrell-Barnes on the back of Charles's book, which was called The End of the Line, and it was all about the state of the world.
It was screened here, actually.
Yeah, well, it's a terrific film and an excellent book, and obviously draws attention to the changing state of the oceans in a very powerful way, and drew a lot of people into that. And Charles wasn't happy to just leave it at that and say, you know, I've done my bit. I've sent this missive out into the world, and other people can take it up. So he and the producers of the film founded the Blue Marine Foundation with the aim of establishing marine protected areas around the world's oceans. And it was them that raised the finance to manage the Chagos Marine Reserve, which was created at the tail end of Gordon Brown's government. David Miliband, and I think almost his last act as foreign minister was to establish this very large marine reserve in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And Blue Marine Foundation is also working in other overseas territories of the UK, such as South Georgia, for example, to try and establish greater marine protection in these places. Now, it's also not ignoring things that are going on in this country, and Blue Marine Federation has been supporting some community groups in Scotland, for example, with efforts to get marine protected areas established in their own local waters. And they've been exploring in Lyme Bay the whole idea of trying to undo some of the harm that was done by some ham-fisted and combative attempts to establish protection within Lyme Bay, which ended up pitching the local fishing community against conservationists and ending up in deadlock with nobody being very happy about the way things were going. So the idea is really to try and restart that process in a more constructive way, and the conference that takes place tomorrow is all about trying to move the process forward in the positive direction that it's begun.
Could you tell us how and when your own interest in marine protected, and where actually your interest in marine protected areas where it started, and a little bit more about that network of protected areas in the North Atlantic and what that's all about?
Well, I began studying protected areas rather a long time ago now, and I think it was about 1990 that I went to dive for the first time in protected areas in the Caribbean. And at that time, my experience was from the Middle East, and the coral reefs of the Red Sea that I was familiar with had lots of big fish, lots of predators hanging around amid thickets of coral. It was a really fantastic experience to come face to face with all of these characters as you went on a dive, and that's about as close to anthropomorphizing as I try to get as a scientist. You've got, I mean, I did spear them at that time in the name of science, and I always ate the specimens later on. But the point. That's right. We always put to a good use, and the undersized ones went to my cats. So then I moved to studying the effects of protection in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean reefs were completely different. They had far fewer in the way of fish, they had less coral, they were perhaps less pretty in a sense. And I thought, well, the Atlantic is a whole different ocean from the Indian and Pacific Oceans. These are places which have evolved separately for millions of years. The Atlantic slammed shut in sometime around the Miocene, so they've been going their own separate paths, and this is how an Atlantic reef looks, and this is how an Indian Ocean reef looks. Well, it turned out that actually, when I started to count fish and measure their sizes at a whole series of sites across the Caribbean, the one thing that explained the differences that I was seeing was how many fishermen were there and active and hunting with spears and nets and traps and so forth. And that just immediately transformed my understanding of how these reefs were shaped and how big an impact people have had on the marine environment. And the other thing which cemented that in my mind was to look at these protected areas which had been set up in the Caribbean and watch over a series of years the reefs beginning to recover, the ledges and nooks and crannies filling up with schools of fish and groupers reappearing in places that they hadn't been before, and over a period of years the amount of fish not just doubling but tripling and quadrupling and quintupling, and amazingly the reef suddenly began to come to life again. And that